let's get to the point. You've written a discussion document entitled Identity and Power in the National Democratic Revolution, the Political Economy of Post-apartheid South Africa. So look, before we dig into the meat of it, I think we need to define some terms for people who may not be familiar with it, because there's a lot to get into. So could you tell us, what is the National Democratic Revolution?
Okay, so the National Democratic Revolution is essentially the program of the National Liberation Movement led by the ANC. The NDR, as we say for short, charts a path from when we are still under apartheid to a post-apartheid South Africa. Its goals were to establish democracy, non-racialism, non-sexism, and a prosperous or a decent life for all in our society. So that's essentially what the NDR is, and those goals are really laid out in the Freedom Charter. The 10 aims of the Freedom Charter.
So when the apartheid machinery was giving away to the democratic dispensation, what was the expectation of you guys for the fulfillment of the NDR?
Well, I think that's a very important question, because I think all of us understood that 1994 was essentially what we characterized as being a democratic breakthrough. In other words, we had transitioned ourselves from being an undemocratic country to a democratic one, with a franchise for all. But none of us were under any illusions about the fact that the rest of what the Freedom Charter said had to be fought for. So 1994 gave us a platform on which we were then supposed to build the new nation, transform the state, transform the economy, change the lives of the poor for the better, ensure better services for people, all of those things that were in the Freedom Charter, transformation of land, for example. Those were all things that were supposed to unfold post-1994.
Amazing. What's your opinion on that, Roscoe?
Well, look, I think at that time, I was just wondering whether that was a realistic expectation, given that the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the end of history, and also all of the events that were happening in the world at that stage, the fall of the Soviet Union, and then subsequently perestroika. So was the NDR a realistic goal for you, looking back to that time then? Were you not, were we all not naive about that?
Yeah, why wasn't anything?
Sorry?
No, it's like no one was even bothered to tell us about this, So try to understand.
That's not true. I mean, those things were all in all the documents that the ANC adopted at its various conferences, all the policy documents, they became policies of the government. So I don't believe in any way were those goals unrealistic. And in fact, the factors that you raised, like the end of the Soviet Union and all of those things, were actually things that enabled the transition in our country, because the National Party was not willing to give up power until, it was made clear to it by the United States government and the Soviet Union that it would have to change. And the same was true of the ANC. It was made clear to the ANC that you have an opportunity to negotiate instead of waged armed struggle. So for those of us who thought we would come back carrying AK-47s, march to the union buildings, put the ANC flag up and the hammer and sickle and declare socialism, the reality was that we were forced to accept negotiations. And I think in hindsight, it was a good thing, because it avoided bloodshed in our country, and we were able to negotiate democracy and the freedom for everybody to begin to change their lives. So I don't think it was an unrealistic goal at all. It's still an important goal.
So who was your mentors, and influences in your early days?
Oh gosh, there's so many.
Post-apartheid.
I was very fortunate to have everybody from Chris Hani to Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, Ray Alexander. You know,
Sure.
it's endless. But you're digressing now. You're going back to me again. Let's stick to the topic.
So, well, then let's dig into the heart of the discussion document. What is your thesis?
Yeah, in simple terms, I'm asking the question that if you look at where we were before 1990 and where we are today in 2021, if you take any indicator that you wish, whether it's real wages, whether it's inequality, whether it's levels of poverty, you can choose just about any socio-economic indicator that you want. By and large, my argument is that nothing has really changed much in those socio-economic indicators from the time before 1990 to today. There are some things that have changed, and I don't want anyone to, hold the view or misunderstand me. I believe that we've done a lot for people. We've delivered clean water, far more electricity than the majority had, even with Eskom's big problems. They never used to supply electricity to most Black people. If you look at opening up access to education, to university, there are many, many good things that have happened in our society. But the fundamental issue is that when it comes to poverty, inequality, and unemployment, very little has changed. And in some instances, things have got worse. I mean, for example, we have far more youth unemployment today than we did 30 years ago. So my argument is that there's something fundamentally wrong with what we're doing in terms of transforming the country, because whilst we've achieved political transformation, we have not achieved socio-economic transformation. And it's now 27, 28 years on. We really have to take stock of this, be honest with ourselves and say, what have we been doing wrong, so that we can fix those things and ensure that we do exactly what we said we would. Have a democratic, non-racist, non-sexist, and prosperous South Africa, where everybody has a stake in the society. At the moment, that's not the case. The poor, the marginalized, women, disabled people, take any of the vulnerable groups, senior citizens. Many of them live in subhuman conditions. They live in informal housing. They do not have clean drinking water. They do not have access to electricity and the warmth that goes with that in the winter. There's high rates of malnutrition and people having poor diets. If you look at the basic income grant proposal, for example, and look at what we're doing with social welfare pensions, these things are the bare minimum that people need to survive. Yet, we're one of the richest countries in the world when it comes to mineral resources. We're strategically placed at the southern tip of Africa. We are crucial. We are crucial for the economy of Africa and for the southern hemisphere. More trade, more investment goes on in this economy than in many other countries in Africa. We're one of the most powerful economies in Africa. Yet, half of our population live in poverty, and a quarter of them live in abject poverty. And we have a tiny number of rich people who control the economy, who benefit from it, who take money out of the country, and who carry on just as they did before 1990. And my thesis is that unless we change those things, then this country is doomed to be a failed state, and the national democratic revolution will have been defeated.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the past, because I think the seeds of where we are today lie in the past. So I want to hear from you whether our macroeconomic policy, initially we had the RDP, and then we changed it to GARE. Do you think that these decisions to change our macroeconomic policy in some way contributed to the malaise that we face today?
Well, I think you've got to go further back to understand that the apartheid government and the apartheid state created all the structural problems that we have in the economy today. I mean, apartheid spatial planning, for example, the way people were meant to travel far long distances to work, the homelands, all of these things, the lack of industrialization, many things contributed to where we are today. A state that was geared up for repression and not for development. So come 1990, in the discussions of ready to govern, and then 1994, the ANC comes to power. The RDP is placed on the table as being a program to take us out of that past. And first of all, I'm not sure that the RDP was correct in all of the things that it said. And I certainly don't think it was radical enough. But be that as it may, it was a proposal to begin this transformation. Then the imposition of GEAR. Now, there are two schools of thought on GEAR. The one is that the government had no choice, and it had to implement it because of the state of the economy. And I think that there is some truth in that. I think its choices were limited. But I think in addition to that, we have to be critical about the fact that even though we put GEAR in place, it didn't mean that we shouldn't have carried on with infrastructure investment, with trying to grow the economy in the way that countries like China, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Korea did. All of those countries had similar problems as to the ones we had, structural problems in the economy. And today we have the NDP, the National Development Plan. I think if one looks at the outcomes, clearly all of those programs were flawed. And I've been part of a discussion today with a group of activists in a chat group. I think that one of the fundamental problems is the failure to implement. I mean, if you look at the Freedom Charter, if you look at the RDP, all of these things, they're great policies, but there's no capacity in the state. The political organizations that we have are weak. And as a result, private capital, or monopoly capital, as they say, still runs the show. And I think that that's the fundamental problem, this implementation. But there were certainly weaknesses in GEAR. There were certainly weaknesses in the RDP and in the National Development Plan today.
That's some things to think about.
Right. So, look, let's go into today and let's talk about what are the drivers, the contemporary drivers that are holding back real progress in achieving the NDR. And who or what ultimately bears responsibility for this lack of progress?
Well, look, I mean, let's start there. The ANC as the governing party must take responsibility for where we are. Whilst we have to acknowledge the impact of apartheid, of colonialism, of slavery, of, the kind of capitalism that we had here, this rapacious capitalism, all of those things created the conditions that we found ourselves in 1994. But the ANC has been in power since 1994, and it must take responsibility for where we are. That's both successes and failures. In terms of what the drivers are, obviously, there are a couple of key things. The one is that the lack of investment into infrastructure, manufacturing, and the economy in general, and the imbalance in the way investment is happening. Building malls, supermarkets, macros, and all of these things, but importing stuff from China to selling them doesn't do our economy any good. Taking minerals out of the ground and selling iron ore, manganese ore, chrome ore without beneficiating it in our economy and selling the beneficiated product all make our economy as weak and vulnerable as it is. I'll give you one example. South Africa has conservatively 95% of the world's platinum. So just think about it, 95%. Yet we're a price taker when it comes to platinum. OPEC controls 40% of the world's oil supply, yet it sets the price for oil. You see, it's that failure of our government to be decisive, to be strong, and to say, look, we control the platinum, therefore this is the price. And the reason that's the price is that is the money that we're going to use to develop our economy. And instead of sending platinum to make catalytic converters in Japan and China, we should be making those things here and exporting those products. So I think that those are the key things. And then obviously the level of skills and education in our country. I mean, instead of transforming the education system and making it the best in the world, what we did is we have actually lowered the standard of education to the lowest common denominator, which is almost the level of education that used to be given in what they called the Bantu education system. I mean, dropping the pass rate for school to 30% is just, it's incredibly stupid, to say the least, because you don't, just because people pass standard 1 or grade 3, as we call it now, grade 5, doesn't mean that they are actually getting the skills and the capabilities that they're going to need when they go out into the labor market. So we're not producing enough skilled graduates from schools, from colleges, from universities. And our education system is doing the worst thing, which is to underdevelop the most important resource in our economy, which is the human capital that we have. So I think those, for me, the investment, the industrial policy that will allow beneficiation and value adding to goods, and the failure to be able to invest efficiently and effectively into human capital are three of the biggest problems that we have.
It's utterly sad that we understand that that's what's happening to our children and the education that they are getting. When I was a kid, I never thought that it would be important to go to private school. And I look how undernourished my child is from public school. So that's something I definitely can agree with. I can't even debate with you right now, Dexter, because you're just saying all the relevant truthful stuff. There's no hiding with you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to get into because your discussion document is it's 51 pages, and I've been.
By the way, it's not a discussion document. It's an academic paper that I'm.
An academic paper, yes. Well, your academic paper is 51 pages, and there's a lot of substance to it. Put it that way. I've been chewing on it for the last few days, and it will be sitting with me for a few weeks to come. One of the passages that really struck me, that you write, I'm going to read it off now. The privileged, wealthy few, no more than 100 or so of them, of black business people who have accumulated substantial wealth, are cognizant of the fact that despite their achievement in being accepted by the capitalist oligarchs who represent a handful of white families at the top as comrades in arms in the pursuit of profit, they are still regarded as second-class members of that club. In fact, they are for the most part a shield against the wrath of the majority, for their existence justifies the capitalist nature of society by presenting it as a non-racial or at least a progressively deracializing one. That's unquote. So, in a few words, why has BEE and then broad-based BEE failed?
Well, you know,
and will it still continue? Before you answer, and will it still continue after everything that just happened here in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, that issue, if you look at what we've experienced in the last week or 10 days, you know, the social unrest we have experienced as a country. I mean, what I said elsewhere in the paper is that we've had this social unrest simmering for more than 20 years, you know, and it's been ebbing and flowing. You'll find it in this township, that township. Sometimes it's over services, sometimes it's over, you know, local issues like taxis or whatever. But the level of social unrest is kind of low intensity, not insurrection, but, you know, a low intensity war with the authorities has been going on, you know, since the 1970s and 1980s, in fact. But it's continued into the democratic society. And the reason for that, again, is this failure to address those issues. And what I'm saying about BEE and, you know, the creation of this small kind of capitalist, black capitalist section of the bourgeoisie is that they don't do anything to fundamentally transform the economy. Look, it's their right to accumulate wealth. So, I mean, if Patrice If Nicky Oppenheimer can be a billionaire, then so can Patrice Motsepe. That's the nature of a democracy. But that wasn't the objective of the ANC. What BEE was supposed to do was to ensure that factories, businesses are owned at every level of our society so that Black people have a stake in the economy. And instead, most Black people have a stake through their pension funds because they're workers and they have a pension, but they have no active involvement in the economy at that level. And the point about this small group of people is that their proximity to monopoly capital and to the white part of monopoly capital in particular means that they create the impression that South Africa is transforming. And therefore we can carry on its business as usual. We don't have to do anything about the structure of the economy. And in that way, as I say, they act as a shield, because when you have social unrest, as we've had, people say things like, oh, well, it's mainly the poor looting and all of these kind of things. But we don't talk about the looting that happens every day at the level of mining companies who take resources out of the country and invoice them at half the price to their sister company in the Cayman Islands. So there's looting going on every day, but it's just at different levels and at a different scale. And I'm not for a moment condoning what happened. I think it's been a tragedy and disgraceful to see people destroying property, destroying the lives. And sadly, it's the small businesses who are going to suffer the most, because Macro and ShopRite and all of them have insurance. They'll be paid out and they'll rebuild their shops and it'll be business as usual. But the woman who owned a salon, or the man who owned a Shisanyama, or the mechanic who had a garage, whose properties were destroyed, are going to have to start from scratch with no insurance. And that's what I mean. It's that continued reproduction of powerlessness, of poverty, and of inequality that is embedded in the structure of our society, of our economy. And that is what makes us a weak economy, a weak state. And that is what will lay the seeds, as I said, for the routing of the NDR unless we radically change direction.
Someone said today about this is actually an opportunity. I'm not going to give names. Clear slating opportunity. Do you feel the same way?
Look, definitely. I think, within every challenge or tragedy or cataclysmic event, there is an opportunity, just as there was with COVID, when the COVID pandemic came. It was an opportunity for us to change the way we do things as a country. I don't think we've done enough to take advantage of that. The same with this terrible unrest and the looting and destruction of property. It's a reset moment for us. And we need to sit down and be honest about the state of affairs, renegotiate a social compact, change the way business is done in this country, change the way services are provided for the better. But whether politicians will do that or not is a function of whether what's happening out there is being led. And unfortunately, most of this stuff that is happening is spontaneous. I don't see any leadership from the ANC as an organization. You don't see it from the SACP, and you don't see it from COSATU. So things are happening in spite of the political organizations, not led by them. 1976 wasn't spontaneous. There was a build-up to 1976. In 1983, the formation of the UDF and the demand for people's power was an organized thing. It was a program of action. But what we are seeing today is the opposite. It's a lack of a program of action that is not challenging the energy of our people towards constructive things.
Yeah.
Well, that brings me on to the question I was going to ask next. My reading of the paper is that your critique is not so much a critique of the liberation movement, but more of a critique or reckoning of capitalist hegemony. So which led me to the next question, which you partially answered. In all of this, where is the left?
Yeah. Look, at my paper is both a critique of the liberation movement and of the capitalist system. I think it's both. But importantly, I'm saying it was the goal and objective of the liberation movement to transform that. And I don't think that we've come anywhere near doing that. So that's the first point. And you're right. I mean, if you think about it, at the moment, what we're doing is just reproducing the same capitalist system and relations of power that were there before 1990. You know, as I said, if you take real wages, for example, no matter what happens, we fight for wage increases and everything. But the purchasing power of the salary or the wage that a worker takes home is either the same as it was in 1990, or in some cases it's less. So that's a failure. That's a failure of, one, the trade union movement, but it's also a failure of the political organizations to come up with something in the form of an intervention that will address that. And I think that absolutely, you know, one of those deafening silences is the silence of the left, of socialists, of communists, of social democrats, to offer alternatives to what we have at the moment. You know, I think that it's obvious, you know, that there's no alternatives being proposed to the current status quo. And it's not that those aren't there in the programs of action of those organizations. But again, you can have everything written down on a piece of paper and it all sounds very radical. But if you're not implementing any of it, then basically you're lying to the masses, you're lying to the people. You're telling them that we're going to build socialism. Well, when? How? What's your program? How are you going to get there? What exactly are you going to do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? That will advance the interests of workers, advance the interests of the poor, and take us from where we are to a better place. That, for me, is the crucial absence that we have.
I think a lot of the reason is our politicians are so busy looking at what the opposition is doing and not actually just worrying about fixing what they've broken. So I don't even think that there will ever be a solution to this.
No, I think one can't be pessimistic. There's always a solution. And it's a choice that we must make. And it requires leadership. I think you're right about politicians being too worried about the opposition. But that's secondary when we realize the fact that what politicians do, many politicians, is just simply looking at their own personal self-interest, looking at what's in it for me. What money can I make as an individual, you know? I think that's a bigger tragedy, and that cuts across all the political formations. You know, I'm not saying it's confined to the ANC. It's in the SACP, it's COSATU, it's in the DA, it's in the EFF. It's how do you build a different kind of cadre that will be the public servant as well as the leader, you know?
I strongly believe that perfect cadre needs to be not affiliated to any political background whatsoever besides being educated in politics. And unfortunately, to be a leader within ANC, DA, or EFF, you have had to have had some sort of mentor, whether that mentor was good or bad, and or contributed to the politics of South Africa. You will never get one of those cadres. You'll never get one of those leaders in your space. But you know me, I have a different opinion about politics in general because I've been there, done that. And I do see that the same issues ANC has, DA definitely has it. It's just that DA is really good at hiding it and making ANC look like the abusive boyfriend and that they are the victim, you know. But it's sad. It's never going to get to that point until higher leadership steps back and says, hey, let's let somebody create a full-on new plan and implement it and follow through. And that's never going to happen because how are they going to benefit if they have to just take their hands off what they've already tried to get?
Yeah, well, I think in my view, you're mixing up a few things. Because as I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with the Freedom Charter, with the program that the National Democratic Revolution is. I think it's about implementation. And I think cadreship is important. But we have had cadre development in the ANC before, in the SACP and COSATU, so it's not impossible to do. I think it's a question of the leadership that's in there and what they're doing about it. My own view is if you're not part of a political organization, then you're not going to be very effective, you know, as an individual. Not to say individuals can't stand to be councillors or whatever, but I think an effective political organization with a program of action is what we need.
Well, Philip, we almost out of time, and I think this is the last question that I have for you, and it's the hardest question of all. What is to be done?
Well, I mean, when we were on our way to Nazareth, we were talking about, rebuilding the ANC, about fixing it up, cleaning it up, making sure that it was fit for purpose. I don't think we've achieved that, and I think that that's one big focus. We need to have leadership inside the organization who run the organization, who are not focused on factionalism and overthrowing their colleagues, but on rebuilding the organization. So that's number one. Number two is, I think, focusing people on implementing that program of action that will lead to development and transformation at a local level, firstly, is a key thing. But then also, what are the policies that we need to implement at a provincial and national level to make that happen? Thirdly, I think where we are pretty good is on our international focus as the ANC. We seem somehow to be a lot more constructive and give a lot more leadership at an international level than we do in our own country. And that should continue because, there are problems in parts of the world, in Palestine, in Kurdistan, in Syria, generally in the Middle East, in South America, and in our own backyard, if you like, on the African continent that we shouldn't give up on. But I think those two key things, rebuilding the ANC as an organization and the alliance partners, and secondly, focusing on implementation of the program of action. For me, that's the most urgent task of the revolution.
Oh, Phillip Dexter, struggle icon, Liverpool fan. You'll never walk around.
Yeah, that's a good song.
Oh, yeah.
Give me 1 second.
I can still play it on the guitar.
Oh my God, really? Dude.
Yeah.
Okay, we won't do that to you in this interview.
Roscoe and I can jam that song together.
Easy.
Do you even know what song we're talking about, Roscoe?
I can play any song, so it doesn't matter.
No, but me and Phillip Dexter's song. Do you know what our favorite song is?
I don't know what that song is.
Do you want to know?
I want to know.
It's